Chapter 23, Psychiatry and Third-Party Payment. Speaking in general, medicine has undergone a revolution. In the good old days, which were not so good, believe me, the patient stood or sat opposite the doctor. The doctor would advise and the patient would consent. Of course, money was a consideration, but it never was really spoken about. If you couldn't afford the doctor, you didn't go, and the doctor would never be so stupid as to offer therapy that his client most probably could not pay for. There was an ad hoc, but very real, selective monetary system going on. This relationship was maintained for the poor and needy, generally on a volunteer basis, and generally, done very unsatisfactorily. This changed when the patient could insure himself, and the insurance company would start bickering and haggling with the doctor. The doctors and hospitals, in particular, also became more open about monetary considerations, making volunteer work more difficult. This was the first step in the removal of the direct doctor-patient relationship. With the organization of insuring your own health, there was a subtle change between the doctor and patient. There was a third party who entered the system. The relationship became different in quality and type. The change was inevitable. Then we came to a very new concept. The idea of universal care. The idea of universal care has nothing to do with medicine, but it is a decision made by society who has decided that this be so. It is a political decision, and as a psychiatrist, I refuse to enter any political discussion involving psychiatry. I, for one, will never forget or forgive the role of my profession played by being useful idiots to the Nazis and the Soviets. As a profession, we have made bedfellows with some very strange people, involving some very strange decisions. You will hear a lot more about that when I talk about psychiatry and the law. The ideas of universal care lack one question. Who is going to pay? In most of Europe and in my Israel, the answer is that the government, or in this case, Social Security collects a fee, which is paid in accordance with the ability to pay, another form of gradual taxation. Then something strange happens. You give according to your ability to give, and you receive in accordance to your needs to receive. This sounds fair enough when we're talking about health, but there are so many inherent problems. Firstly, who decides what the needs are? Secondly, who decides on the quality and priority of how the needs will be delivered? You now see a whole set of instances creeping in, whereby there will be monitoring, evaluation, prioritization and prior authorization. Who makes all these decisions? Basically, the upper echelon is a political decision, and as such, there is political infighting, lobbying and interests of all sorts. We then arrive at the situation where we have so-called empowerment. Along the way, we need not forget and merely pay lip service to the fact that we have added a whole bureaucratic superstructure which usually can be very inefficient and certainly very expensive. Another thing was forgotten. In the beginning, monetary considerations were always there, and now, are no longer because everybody is entitled to everything. To suggest otherwise is tantamount to blasphemy. The doctor-patient relationship no longer exists, and in its place are two parallel relationships, patient health authority and doctor health authority. As you will see, when dealing with the community system, this can become a very substantive problem. The doctor has decoupled from the doctor-patient relationship and now is involved with the faceless executives who employ or pay the doctor. The doctor no longer is only asking how best to help the patient, but how much they are receiving. This is legitimate. Entering into the ecological system are the politicians and those who benefit by selling ancillary services, in particular, the pharmaceutical companies. The health provider has to provide health. This means not only supplying doctors and other staff, but providing hospitals and medication. Again, we see another mess. In a system which is basically socialistic and bureaucratic, there are highly lean and competitive capitalistic-orientated drug companies, and some very unpleasant things are happening. You only have to look at the marketing of Prozac and what has happened since to realize that the bottom line for the drug companies is to make money, and they do. Unfortunately, in particular in psychiatry, the physicians have sold their souls to the pharmaceutical industry. Psychiatry is now all about giving the right medication to the right person at the right time, without mentioning the fact that someone is making a very large profit. The drug companies need the doctors to help them do research and discover new drugs. So, The university teaching hospital is the place to be. There is money. There is none out in the boonies with the great unwashed, the chronic schizophrenic. So, guess where the doctors are and want to be. Another joke. There is a saying in Russia, but if Olga falls off the cart, the horse is very happy. Unfortunately, it is true. To fully understand how follow-up works, I asked a colleague what happens if a chronic patient does not turn up. He told me that joke about Olga. If you remember, a dropout amongst the chronic patients means hospitalization is on its way. Far too often, the wonder drug company is encouraged by the success of another company to beat the patents on the medication by slightly modifying the drug. Now that the drug company has the item that it wants to sell on its brochure, how does it do this? If the health organizations are those who are providing the medication, then they will want the cheapest and best medication. I mean the one that will lead them to being sued less. I will mention the role of the legal system in a few minutes. How does the organization decide which medications to buy? First of all, the medication has to be approved, and for this, the pharmaceutical companies need the avid support of the doctors or at least certain doctors. A similar process goes on between the pharmaceutical company and the health provider, where all sorts of manipulations come into play. I dare not write down what I believe is happening because I think I will be sued. But deals on different packages are made, and they are not always in the open. Another aspect comes into play. The patient has rights, and quite rightly so. They always have, and it has always been part of our profession. The first thing we do is to swear on the Hippocratic Oath, or in the case of the Israelis, the equivalent Rambam Oath. So, we don't really need lessons in how to care for our patients, and certainly not from the lawyers. I make no bones about it. I have as little respect and patience for lawyers as I have for pharmaceutical companies. Read this and judge for yourself, but don't accept it as gospel. There will be more people thinking differently from me than those that agree with me. The lawyers then enter into a complex and complicated quadrille with the provider, and probably the insurance companies who represent both the provider and the doctor. Medical insurance has become preposterously high. This is in part, in my opinion, is due to a very large part of very expensive preparations by the insurer. Again, through fear of being sued, I'm not going to mention what. If you do want to get an insight, I suggest that you read my book, a novel going into this subject in a way that will not lead me to being sued. The book is called Sins and Lovers and is available on Amazon. Empowerment, I have already mentioned. Certainly, this is also providing a lot of background noise, which in my opinion is generally extraneous. It would be so easy if everyone were to remember two things. First, one day in a hospital costs a lot of money, and secondly, we are talking about optimal care and not optimum care. Optimal care, not optimum care, means that everybody receives something which is professionally acceptable. The newest is not the best, and the most expensive is certainly not the best. To make ludicrous claims on the behalf of the needy that they should be treated as if they were not needy is lunacy. If there was no universal insurance, in the same circumstances, the most substantial and wealthy patient would certainly be thinking about costs, benefits, and effectiveness. I not only believe that third-party payment and universal care are here to stay, but in my opinion, they should be here to stay. But, we are talking about effectiveness and optimal care. In an ideal world, this is what I would do. I would most certainly only insure a patient once he has agreed to capping any legal claim and accept any claim to be made in an arbitration system which is approved of when joining the health company. Where the government either directly or indirectly pays for the health service, there should be an open and explicit demand that only generic treatment should be used as first choice. Only when this has failed, after an agreed test, then the more expensive treatment should be applied. The next suggestion is verging, not on heresy, but is out and out sacrilege. I would make the following suggestions. If a medication is to be eventually bought by the nationalized or socialized medical care system, then the government should set up an independent research council. The research council should then decide in which direction research should go, not merely research circumventing patents as we mentioned above. Having done this, the research should be budgeted and tenders be published, whereby the pharmaceutical companies can make their offer to do the research and have built-in profits as long as the patent exists. I would use the model used in the defense industry where the government decides what it wishes to buy and develop. I firmly believe that if we are to have good medicine, we can also have well-organized medicine, which means making it cheaper and more efficient. This I would do by making my expenses less expensive by cutting costs. In third-party payment, universal care services are set up after consulting with the experts. In other words, those who provide a service will decide what that service will be and not those who are receiving it. This often means that the service will be provided in accordance with the needs to give it and far less with the needs of those to receive it. We see far more hospitals and centers of countries in large cities, and when you go out to the periphery, the services are much worse. It is far sexier to be a physician in a university college hospital and far less sexy to be in a village in the community healthcare. When you add to this that the doctor practicing in the hospital will be getting all kinds of benefits from doing night duty and being on call, not to mention research, then you realize just why this is happening. Unfortunately, this phenomenon is exaggerated in psychiatric health care. We changed the name to community psychiatric centers, but in reality, very little has changed. Let's ask ourselves why? The health provider has a budget, and he has to exist within that budget. He has two sources of expense. One in the community and one in the hospitals. The provider knows fine well that you cannot have two patients in one bed. In other words, hospitalization expenses are capped. This is not so in the community, especially when psychiatric diagnoses and the service needs are vague at best. The health provider knows that he cannot prevent a bed in a psychiatric hospital from being filled. Just as there is no such thing as two people in one bed, there is no such thing as an empty bed. To claim that it is possible is as feasible as taking the milk out of your tea. The only way you can reduce hospitalization is by reducing the number of beds. In order to do this, community care has to be beefed up. But this costs money. There is no guarantee, having increased your expenses in the community, that you're going to then be able to cut down on hospital beds without undergoing a barrage from very self-interested groups, with very marked though undeclared, vested interests in why the hospital bed shouldn't be closed. Let's mention the concept of funny money. If the health provider is also the owner of facilities providing care, there will be an inbuilt skewing to give services and keep it in-house. Of course, there is a budget, but the budget is on paper only and the figures move backwards and forwards without any money being involved. In this respect, if there is no competition between the hospitals or any other unit due to a built-in bias, there will be built-in inefficiency. Any effort by the health provider to do more than buy services, but try and give them himself, is an iron-cast certainty to fail. So, here is another reform. All services must be paid with real money. There must competition and accountability. You get neither if no money changes hand. When we are talking about universal care, we are talking about the medical model which has been shoehorned into this new concept. There is still lip service to the medical model which is hierarchical. Unfortunately, the medical model does not work in every situation. In Israel, we have found that this model failed completely when dealing with nurses in school care, geriatrics, addiction and psychiatry. In the present model, we find that the medical model is supported now by the competing providers, and this is causing chaos in the psychiatric system. There is no doubt that the locus of care should be community and the patient should only be removed from the community as a last resort. He can then be brought back to the community as quickly as possible. All community care consists of an integration of all services. The services are monolithic in all municipalities and regional government. If we are to have a fully integrated social care system, then they cannot have one group of monolithic community services meeting with a whole load of different competing health organizations representing and integrating their psychiatric patients into the community. It simply does not work. In Israel, no matter how long the psychiatric health reform was planned to bring psychiatry into the community, it failed because of the failure of the interface between the health provider and the other community services. For any psychiatric care system to work, there must be a monolithic mental health care provider in the community. This can be done quite simply by tendering the service to the different health providers and to make the losers use the service with the same ability to audit as they would do otherwise. There is no such thing as a lost patient. If the auditor who is in charge of the patient's care does not know where the patient is, the lost patient will be eventually hospitalized. In other words, there has to be a comprehensive follow-up of every known patient for at least 1 year after hospitalization, and if he is a recidivist, it should be there much longer. There must be active reaching out for the patient lost in the community to find out what is going on with him and persuade him to return to a system where his health will be constantly monitored and support provided immediately. Most of the service for the severely mentally ill should be provided by a nurse, as they find it much easier to integrate with other community networks. Not only that, but there should be at the least more than lip service paid to the fact that every mentally ill child has parent and family. Moreover, many mentally ill patients also have family children. All of them are at risk and the support system should be evaluated and strengthened or replaced when needed. In other words, rehabilitation and follow-up of the patient must be proactive in every sense of the word. It cannot be that if you are going to visit the dentist, you will be reminded at least twice before the visit to show up, and yet, a psychiatric patient either shows up or doesn't, depending on what mood he is in. Using a computer, it is very easy to detect follow-up dropouts, to reach out and see what is going wrong, and why and how we can rectify the matter. The overall coordination has to be from the emergency room back to the community. Our goal is a continuity of care provided in a continuum of services where each step is closely monitored and we make sure that the patient is not lost. In an ideal situation, the emergency room should be more than a place where the hospital decides to accept or not accept a patient. The emergency room should be the nerve center of all the follow-up processes. It should be asking why and how the community care failed and when the patient arrived. It should be asking and stating what the tentative treatment program is, and where will the patient be released to when released? Yes, on day 1, we should be planning the continuity and continuum of care. Treatment cannot be only focal, it must be a systematic overview of both the patient and the system. By doing this, we are collecting enough information about the patient and the system to see how the system is functioning and how well they are caring for the patient. The health provider must take full responsibility for setting up the system and the follow-up, and be able to prioritize which services are given according to importance of budget. As I mentioned before, follow-up is of great importance and medication is of far less importance. It is far more important to make sure the patient is getting medication and support them to decide, than fight over what is going to be given and if it is the most expensive drug or not. Support should include cheap support systems, such as medium to large psychotherapy groups designed for the severely mentally ill and to act as support systems. Above all, the provider must have aims, priorities and guidelines. Laissez-faire does not work. Clear priorities must be set and auditing must consist on not asking why did you? But far more important, why did you not see? To prevent dropout in psychotherapy, which is over 60% in the first 3 visits, we must insist the default be that the patient must initially attend group therapy. Otherwise, half of the therapist's time is waiting for the no-show. None of these suggestions are rocket science. In my experience, I have set up such systems which are capable of setting priorities and auditing the service to ascertain whether it is being given as planned or not. Not only can you and should you be following up on the individual, but you should be carefully monitoring services provided and making sure that they are for the good of the person receiving treatment and not for those who are giving it. For all of this to change, we must change the managerial system. I know that explaining this would bore the pants off you. But, if you really want to know, go into my site and get in touch. I have a promise to keep. Why has online therapy not taken off? There is always one question. Who is the user and who is the payer? They cannot be the same in universal care. If a therapy is free, the entry is larger and the dropouts are also larger. The dropout rate in free care is enormous. Online, it would be more so. In terms of marketing, once a patient enters the therapist room and has paid, they have made a commitment of sorts. A commitment that can and usually does grow. In marketing terms, the patient is well in the funnel. If he has yet to pay, there are delays in appointments and the therapist changes, all common occurrences in third-party payment. The patient is far further away from the marketing funnel. Finally, to handle online therapy, the patient has to be in a reasonably good state of mind. So, what is the online therapy niche? As I said, dropout rates are a major problem in third-party provisions. Online therapy could be offered as a replacement to the waiting list, but not as a replacement for face-to-face group therapy. Here, we may increase dropout until the patient sees a therapist. Then, we run into a new problem. Who approves of the therapy? If a provider decides to buy the service, he will need in-house professional approval. Then arises the question, why not do this alone instead of buying? Along come the committees. The kind that designed the donkey and produced a camel. If third party has not made the doctor-patient relationship difficult, then we must realize there is another complication, the legal profession.